He sat at the table enjoying his meal, only to feel his medal ripped from his chest, until the roar of boots hit the floor 4 minutes later. The waitress yanked the medal from Harold Jenkins's uniform, a sharp, unexpected tug that echoed in the otherwise quiet family restaurant. The force of it nearly pulled the 68-year-old veteran from his seat, sending a greasy spatter of gravy from his fork onto the crisp white tablecloth. Another dark stain blossomed on the lapel of his neatly pressed uniform. His right hand flew instinctively to his chest, fingers closing on empty air, where the familiar weight of the silver disc had rested moments before. That medal cost me more than most men pay for their lives. Why is she treating it like garbage? His eyes, wide and disbelieving, fixed on the waitress. She now held the gleaming medal aloft, its ribbon dangling, a sneer twisting her lips. Her name tag, pinned crookedly to her stained apron, read Brenda. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the ribbon, and her eyes, narrowed to slits, bored into Harold Jenkins with an undisguised, raw contempt. The overhead fluorescent lights, harsh and unforgiving, glinted off the polished surface of the medal as she raised it higher, as if presenting a trophy won through disdain. A hush fell over the surrounding tables, the clinking of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation dying away abruptly. Brenda's voice, harsh and cutting, sliced through the sudden, thick silence. "We don't allow that kind of display in here, old man." Her gaze swept dismissively over his uniform, lingering for a moment on the other patches and ribbons, a clear challenge embedded in her stance. Harold Jenkins' heart pounded a frantic, painful drumbeat against his ribs, a rhythm of pure shock and rising humiliation. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, his throat suddenly tight, constricted, and dry. He felt exposed, stripped bare, as if the medal hadn't just been stolen, but his very dignity ripped away with it. Before we continue with the story, be sure to let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in the comments. We love learning about our viewers. Now let's get back to the story. A few patrons at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting nervously between Harold Jenkins and the aggressive waitress. A young woman seated at a booth across the aisle fumbled for her smartphone, her fingers hovering indecisively over the camera icon, a troubled expression on her face. The once comforting aroma of grilled steak and fried onions now seemed acrid and cloying in the suddenly charged, hostile atmosphere. Harold Jenkins' hands began to tremble, a tremor he couldn't control, and he clenched them tightly under the table, hidden from view, trying desperately to regain some semblance of composure. Brenda, emboldened by the shocked silence and Harold Jenkins's stunned immobility, took a small, deliberate step back, still holding the medal out, as if it were a soiled rag she was about to discard. "This isn't a parade ground, it's a restaurant, for normal people." Her voice held a sneering triumph, her eyes glinting with a strange satisfaction. Harold Jenkins felt a hot, prickling flush creep up his neck, spreading across his face. "She thinks I'm putting on a show. She doesn't understand what this means, what it represents." The casual, brutal dismissal of his service, of the sacrifices the medal embodied, stung far more than the physical act of her snatching it. He finally found his voice, though it emerged as a raspy, hoarse whisper. "Give that back to me." His words were barely audible, weak against the harshness of her earlier tone, almost lost in the heavy silence that still gripped the room. Brenda merely scoffed, a short, sharp sound of pure derision. She turned her head slightly, her gaze flicking towards the other patrons, as if seeking their approval, their validation for her actions. A few people looked away quickly, unwilling to meet her eye, or the profound hurt in Harold Jenkins. The shame he felt was a physical weight, almost unbearable. Harold Jenkins slowly, painfully, pushed his chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the cheap tiled floor, a jarring, discordant sound in the heavy, expectant silence. His movements were stiff, his joints protesting, like an old, worn machine, grinding reluctantly to a halt. His eyes, however, remained fixed on the medal, still clutched in Brenda's hand, a silent, desperate plea held within their depths. The gravy stain on his lapel seemed to spread further, a dark, ugly blotch mirroring the growing darkness that clouded his mind. He just wanted the medal back. He wanted to escape this humiliating public spectacle. Brenda, sensing his movement, sensing his intention to rise, tightened her grip on the medal's ribbon. A flicker of something, perhaps a renewed defiance or a touch of fear, crossed her face quickly. She held it further away from him, deliberately keeping it just out of his reach, her arm extended. The harsh glare of the overhead lights reflected off the medal's silver surface, blinding Harold for a disorienting moment, making the decoration seem even more distant, more unattainable. He took a tentative step forward, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him, the old war wounds in his hip and knee aching with the sudden, unwelcome tension. The manager, a portly man with a fringe of dark hair ringing a balding patty, finally emerged from the kitchen entrance at the back, drawn by the unnatural, prolonged quiet that had descended upon his dining room. He surveyed the scene, his brow furrowed in initial confusion, then deepening into visible alarm as his eyes landed on Brenda, still holding the medal, and Harold Jenkins, standing before her, his face a mask of anguish. The manager took a hesitant step forward, then stopped abruptly, clearly unsure how to intervene, how to de-escalate such a public, volatile confrontation. The air in the restaurant grew thick with unspoken words and palpable tension. Harold Jenkins's hand reached out, trembling visibly towards the medal he so cherished. His weathered fingers brushed the empty air, agonizingly close, but unable to grasp the silver. Brenda, with a sudden, sharp, almost involuntary movement, recoiled from his touch. Her arms swung wide in a defensive, panicked gesture. The medal, its ribbon slick with her nervous sweat, slipped from her grasp. A sharp, metallic clang echoed through the stunned restaurant as the medal clattered onto the tiled floor. The medal's clang resonated, a tiny, devastating sound in the suddenly vast silence of the restaurant. It spun once, twice, catching the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead fluorescent lights, before settling with a final, dull thud, face down on the cold, unforgiving tile. Harold Jenkins's eyes followed its trajectory, his heart sinking with each sickening rotation. He knew that sound, the familiar metallic thud of fallen honor, all too well. That sound should only be heard on a parade ground when a brother stumbles, never in a place like this, treated like refuse. His initial shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard knot of anger. A low murmur rippled through the patrons, a collective intake of breath. The young woman with the phone, who had been hesitant before, now clearly aimed her device, the small red light of a recording flashing steadily. Other phones appeared almost instantly, glowing rectangles held aloft by unseen hands, their lenses all fixed on Brenda, on Harold Jenkins, and on the medal gleaming on the floor. The din of conversation, which had died down earlier, now began to rise again, but this time it was laced with hushed whispers, indignant gasps, and the distinct clicking of phone cameras capturing the unfolding drama. Harold felt a sudden, piercing shame that his humiliation was now becoming a spectacle, broadcast for anyone to see. Brenda stared down at the medal on the floor, her expression momentarily unreadable. For a fleeting second, a flicker of something that might have been regret, or perhaps fear, crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened, defensive resolve. She did not bend to pick it up. She did not move. The manager took another hesitant step forward, his voice a strained, anxious whisper. "Brenda, what?" But his words trailed off, utterly lost in the rising tide of murmurs from the tables and the incessant, almost rhythmic clicking of phone cameras documenting every second of the confrontation. Harold Jenkins' gaze, burning with a righteous fury, shifted from the fallen medal to Brenda's defiant face. He took a slow, deliberate step towards the medal, his 68-year-old body moving with a surprising stiffness born of old injuries and fresh indignation. His hand, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline and shock, reached down for it. He wanted to scoop it up, to hide it away from prying eyes, to make this whole nightmarish scene simply disappear. The desire to simply escape, to salvage what little dignity he had left in this degrading situation, was overwhelming. His vision blurred for a moment, and he blinked hard, forcing back the moisture that threatened to well in his eyes, refusing to show further weakness. Brenda, as if jolted from a trance by his movement, suddenly shifted. She stepped directly in front of the medal, physically blocking Harold Jenkins' path to retrieve it, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a defiant, immovable barrier. "You're not welcome here with that," she stated, her voice lower now, less shrill, but no less firm, a clear challenge embedded in every carefully enunciated syllable. Harold Jenkins stopped short, his hand still outstretched, frozen in midair, inches from his medal. "She won't even let me retrieve what's mine. This is unacceptable. This is an insult I cannot ignore." The confrontation escalated rapidly. The manager, finally seeing Brenda's continued, inexplicable defiance, at last found his voice, louder this time, edged with panic. "Brenda, move! What in the world are you doing?" His face was flushed a deep red, a mixture of anger at his employee and profound embarrassment evident in his features. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that videos were being recorded, knew the irreparable damage this incident was doing to his restaurant's reputation with every passing second. Harold Jenkins stood his ground, his eyes locked on Brenda, a silent, intense battle of wills playing out over the small silver disc on the floor. Harold Jenkins's jaw tightened until his muscles ached. The blood rushed to his head, a hot, surging wave of pure, unadulterated indignation. "She has no right at all to touch it, to deny me it, to disrespect what it stands for." He knew, with absolute certainty, that he couldn't leave without his medal, not after all he had endured for it, not after this public shaming. It was more than just a piece of shaped metal. It was a testament to his service, a memory etched in silver, a symbol of brothers lost. He clenched his fists by his sides, the muscles in his forearms tightening into hard knots. His pride, deeply wounded but not broken, fueled his resolve. He pulled out his worn, old-fashioned cell phone from his pocket, his fingers fumbling slightly with the familiar device. His vision was still a little blurry, a combination of unshed tears of frustration and the burning rage that consumed him. But he managed to navigate to his contacts list. He found the familiar name, a lifeline in this moment of utter despair and public humiliation. The numbers on the screen seemed to blur together for a second, but his fingers, guided by long habit, remembered the sequence. The steady, almost reassuring ringing tone on the other end was the only sound he registered, momentarily drowning out the whispers and camera clicks that surrounded him. A voice, rough but instantly familiar, answered on the third ring. "Jenkins? What's up, old man? You okay?" It was Sergeant Miller, his former platoon leader, a man who had seen him through more than one hellish situation, a man he trusted implicitly. Harold Jenkins' voice cracked slightly, the carefully controlled dam of his composure finally breaking as he spoke, the humiliation and the burning anger pouring out. "Miller, it's about my medal, my service medal. They won't let me have it. This waitress," he relayed the events of the last few minutes, his voice rising with each word, the story tumbling out in a rush of disbelief and fury. Miller's response was immediate, clipped, and firm, with no hesitation. "Say no more, old man. Give me the address. We're on our way." The line went dead abruptly. Harold Jenkins slowly lowered his phone, a strange sense of calm washing over him, replacing the panic and helpless fury that had gripped him moments before. He looked at Brenda's defiant stance, then at the medal still glinting on the floor, then at the sea of flashing phones held by the restaurant patrons. He stood taller, his shoulders squaring almost imperceptibly, his gaze hardening into resolve. The din of conversation faded as phones rose. The roaring hum of a powerful engine, too loud for a regular passenger car, suddenly cut through the ambient street noise, followed immediately by the sharp screech of tires as a large, black SUV slid to a halt directly at the curb outside the restaurant's front windows. Sergeant Miller threw open the passenger door before the vehicle had even fully stopped, his powerful, uniformed frame exiting with a controlled, focused urgency. Behind him, a second, identical black SUV pulled up with the same abruptness, and similarly built men, all in various stages of military uniform or tactical gear, began to emerge swiftly, their faces grim and utterly purposeful. Each man moved with the silent, practiced efficiency of trained professionals, their collective focus absolute. Inside the restaurant, Harold Jenkins stood his ground, a lone, aging figure, facing down a hostile waitress and a bewildered, increasingly panicked manager, with a crowd of curious, phone-wielding onlookers avidly filming his predicament. The phone in his hand felt heavy, a tangible connection to the impending storm he knew was about to break. He knew they were coming. He knew his brothers in arms would not let this stand, not this insult. His gaze remained fixed on Brenda, who still stood guard over his medal, her expression now a mixture of defiance and a dawning, growing unease as the distant sounds of rapidly approaching commotion began to filter unmistakably through the restaurant's heavy glass doors. A loud, distinct thump echoed from just outside, followed by another, then the rhythmic, unmistakable pounding of multiple pairs of heavy boots hitting the pavement, growing louder, closer, with each passing second. The manager's head snapped towards the entrance, a visible flicker of raw panic now evident in his wide eyes. He clearly recognized the sound, the unmistakable, disciplined rhythm of marching feet, approaching with both speed and undeniable intent. The whispers and murmurs inside the restaurant died down once more, almost instantly, replaced by a heavy, anticipatory silence, thick with apprehension. Every eye turned towards the door. Sergeant Miller, leading the charge, sprinted the last few yards towards the restaurant's main entrance, his breath coming in heavy, but even bursts, his eyes already scanning the interior of the storefront. He saw Harold Jenkins through the window, standing firm and unbroken, and the sight fueled his already determined pace. Behind him, the rest of the platoon moved like a well-oiled, unstoppable machine, flanking him closely, their steps perfectly synchronized and relentlessly purposeful. The sheer sudden presence of so many uniformed, determined individuals on the sidewalk made the few remaining pedestrians scatter quickly, sensing the palpable gravity of the unfolding situation. The heavy glass door of the restaurant burst inward with a sudden, jarring thud, pushed open with a force that made the frame rattle. Sergeant Miller stepped through the doorway first, his gaze sweeping the room in a fraction of a second, immediately locking onto Harold Jenkins. His eyes then dropped to the medal, glinting on the floor, and then to the waitress standing defiantly over it, a vein throbbing visibly in his temple. He did not pause, not for an instant. His powerful, purposeful strides carried him directly into the main dining area, followed closely, almost seamlessly, by his entire platoon, their boots loud on the tile. The manager, finally snapping into some semblance of action, albeit a panicked and ill-advised one, tried to intercept Sergeant Miller, extending a trembling arm as if to block his path. "Sir, you can't just barge in here like this. We have customers. This is private property." His voice was a high-pitched, panicked squeak against the sudden, overwhelming surge of disciplined authority that now filled the room. Miller did not break stride, did not even look at him, simply pushed the manager's outstretched arm down with a firm, dismissive motion. The manager stumbled back, aghast and sputtering, but made no further attempts to impede their inexorable progress. Brenda's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine, unadulterated fear finally replacing her stubborn defiance as she watched the phalanx of serious, uniformed men advance steadily upon her position. Her posture, once so rigid with contempt, visibly stiffened, and she took an involuntary, stumbling step back from the medal, her bravado crumbling. The air in the restaurant crackled with a raw, potent energy, an almost physical pressure. The rhythmic, intimidating clatter of heavy combat boots on the tiled floor was the only sound now, a steady, ominous beat that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, a sound of impending reckoning. Harold Jenkins slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the familiar, determined faces of his arriving platoon. A wave of profound relief, so intense it was almost dizzying, washed over him, easing the tight band of tension around his chest. His lips twitched slightly, the ghost of a weary smile touching his face for the first time since the ordeal began. He felt his shoulders relax, the crushing weight of humiliation and helplessness that had gripped him for what felt like an eternity slowly beginning to ease. He was no longer alone. His family, his brothers, had arrived. The platoon fanned out with practiced, disciplined precision, creating a solid, unwavering line that spanned the width of the restaurant, forming up directly behind Harold Jenkins. Their presence was immediate, overwhelming, a silent wall of quiet, unshakable strength and unwavering resolve. Their eyes, sharp and uniformly focused, were fixed on Brenda and the medal still lying on the floor between her and Harold. No one spoke a word. No one needed to. The message was abundantly clear, conveyed by their unified, formidable presence and the palpable coiled tension they brought into the room. Harold Jenkins took a single, deliberate step back, placing himself squarely in front of the unwavering line of his platoon, protected and supported. He looked from Brenda's now pale and frightened face to his medal, then back at the waitress, his eyes holding a renewed, quiet power, devoid of the earlier desperation. The heavy glass doorway behind his platoon seemed to fill with even more of their comrades, their uniformed shoulders blocking out the light from the street, a formidable, unyielding sight, uniformed soldiers filling the doorway.